Well, it's not often you get both pre-butted and apologized to before you walk out on stage. As you all will have gathered, the two voices who we're going to hear from next come at a lot of the issues that we have been wrestling with throughout the day from a different perspective and from a long perspective of experience. So we welcome both your voices to the stage, and thank you for joining us. Let me introduce John Walters, who was drug czar under President George W. Bush, now at the Hudson Institute, and Steve Cook, president of the National Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys. We are continuing on the theme of crime and punishment, and specifically talking about drug crimes in this conversation, and considering whether the current push for lighter sentencing for getting rid of mandatory minimums might, in fact, do more harm than good. Let me start with an issue that's very much in the news. We've talked about it. It's come up in a couple of the conversations on stage already, and that is the push from the Obama administration. This fall, more than 6,000 drug-related inmates are being released early, getting out of prison early, benefiting from this recommendation for a reduction in drug sentences. More than 40,000 are expected to follow. John, I gather that in principle you think this is a terrible idea. Why?
Well, I don't think it's a bad idea for the president to use clemency power. That's been the longstanding authority of the executive to make corrections when the institutions of justice may be not operating as they should. Mm-hmm. I think you take responsibility for the decisions you make and you justify them. So I think the authority to do this isn't a question. If the larger issue is, I think the question and some of the discussion here has been, is has the criminal justice system been unjust in the way it's tried to handle crime? And I recognize that you can draw the line at what sentences should be, but I also think that you have to face the facts that some of the current system was led by the victimization of some of the very people who, now the administration claims it's championing, and some of the people you've heard today. I served originally in the Reagan administration in the education department, which is how I got working on prevention, education, and drugs, and others. I didn't, and a lot of other things, but got into the area of drug control on the basis first of prevention, and then looked at law enforcement. And I've been in community meetings in Anacostia and Harlem and Watts, and I've been in the neighborhoods and sat with the people who have suffered. In 2002, I spoke at the funeral of Angela Dawson in Baltimore, mm-hmm. who had her entire family killed, including 5 children, by the firebombing by criminals who she stood up to in her neighborhood. That person who was convicted of that was out and not properly supervised from criminal conviction. So I think we have to ask ourselves when we do this, on the one hand, we want mercy. On the other hand, we want to stop victimization. And I've heard an awful lot of people, some of the voices I didn't hear here today, I haven't been able to stay for the whole program, of people who call the police just like anybody else does anyplace else, but in their neighborhood, the police are not able to stop the crime adequately for them. Their kids walk back and forth across the areas controlled by gangs and drug dealers. They want the same thing that people want in Chevy Chase, D.C. when they live in Anacostia. So I think the voice of some of the people here, they don't want misbehaving police officers. Everybody understands that. And there still can be human beings who fail in any institution. But the fact of the matter is, the people who are the largest victims are the people who live usually in lower socioeconomic groups, and especially African-American males.
On this specific issue, though, whether or not it's a good idea to have lesser sentences, early releases for people serving sentences on drug offenses, given what we know about overcrowding in prisons, given what we know about how much it costs the American taxpayer to keep somebody in prison for a long time, why not knock a year or two off some of these sentences? Start bringing those down to bring those problems under control.
Again, the amount of the sentence can vary from time to time. Mm-hmm. Mandatory minimums were designed to create equality across the federal system for people who did similar offenses. So in one place, you didn't have people being treated more harshly than in other places. But again, I would say, look, in some ways you're focusing on the wrong thing, and some people touched on it. If you want to stop the number of people who are both victimized and are victimizers, you have to get ahead of the point at which they go, especially into the federal system. You have to do a better job with education. You have to be more candid about the family. People have to take more responsibility. We haven't fixed that problem. And that's not just a person of color issue. It's becoming increasingly a matter of white, lower socioeconomic individuals. So I think the issue here is if schools don't work, if the juvenile justice system doesn't work, if the public health system doesn't work, if the family takes a walk and it doesn't work, and we don't even talk about that significantly and as a mainstay, then you expect the criminal justice system to pick this up, especially for males, no matter what color they are. And that is something that is the wrong way to fix the problem, and you can't then fix the problem by letting males who have become criminogenic, and most of the time, I think you've got to face the fact, you look at the data here, you want to follow the data, that people offend over and over and over again before they come into the system, and certainly before they ever do any prison or jail time. So it's not the first-time offender. It's not frequently a matter of we didn't know this person was an offender. We let them through the system, and we don't respond effectively. We need better intervention, but yes, it needs resources, but it also needs a priority. I'm disappointed the president hasn't made this more of a priority until he's almost out of office.
Steve, let me draw you into this, because you've made an interesting point as a prosecutor. Made the argument that mandatory sentences, that harsh prison sentences, serve, among other purposes, from your point of view, that they coax witnesses to cooperate. They give you a tool.
They do, and that's
Explain.
It is a critical part of the mandatory minimums and how they work as a tool for federal prosecutors. Before I do that, if I could address the release, the issue of release, a couple things that are important to know about that. First of all, we're not talking about releasing low-level offenders. The federal prisons are full of significant drug traffickers. In fact, if you look at the statistics, what you'll see from the Sentencing Commission is that less than 5% of the individuals incarcerated in federal prison were found by a district judge to have, the sentencing judge to have a mitigating role, that is, to say that they had a minor or minimal participation. They're significant drug traffickers. So that's the first thing you need to know. Second thing is, as you talk about these releases, we're not talking about 6,000, and you've alluded to this. We're already in the third round of reductions. The first two rounds of reductions involved 24,000 orders of early release. The third round that we're on now has 6,000 to 8,000 this week, and then will be followed, as you've already said, by another 40,000. I'm going to say it again. These are not low-level offenders. These releases are people are eligible for these releases regardless of the drug quantity, regardless of their criminal history, regardless of their ties to gangs, and regardless of their ties to drug cartels. I'll give you one example of somebody who benefited that I prosecuted. This particular individual was caught with 213 kilograms of 98% pure cocaine, along with $500,000 in cash. He's he's out as a result of these reductions. So if anybody's laboring under the impression that the people who are getting out are low-level offenders, we should disabuse them of that.
Well, some of them are. I mean, some of these are people who are coming out after a dozen years, having served what I think we would all agree are, dealing marijuana on the street corner. And I guess, if we all agree that a pinnacle of the American justice system is that the crime fit the punishment, be proportionate to the punishment, is a dozen years for something like that?
Nobody's in prison for 12 years for selling dime bags on the street.
What is the solution? If you look at the overcrowded prisons, if you look at the burden to the taxpayer, if it's not reducing sentences for these crimes as opposed to violent crimes, what do you do?
Well, the minimum mandatories, for example, with respect to heroin, the 10-year mandatory minimum isn't triggered until you deal with a kilogram of heroin. It's $70,000 to $100,000 worth of heroin. So we're not talking about, and that sets a minimum. Judges very often go higher than that. So the sentences that are being imposed with respect to those mandatory minimums are not the crazy sentences that they're being made out to be. These are not low-level marijuana street traffickers.
But setting that aside, I mean, to my point of what would you like to see change? If we all agree the criminal justice system could be better, how do you fix it?
First of all, let me say that I do not think that the federal criminal justice system is broken. In fact, just the opposite. Let me say this.
Hang on.
With respect to the federal criminal justice system, beginning in about 1985, Congress passed a series of laws that allowed us to put major drug traffickers and violent offenders in prison. After we started that, we started to fill the prisons up. Isn't any question about that? By about 1991, we saw these historic violent crime rates that were exploding. We saw them start to come down. We continued to prosecute high-level drug traffickers and violent felons, and we continued to put them in federal prison. And as we did that, violent crime continued to come down until right now, and you heard it from other speakers, we're now experiencing some historic lows in violent crime. Those historic lows are most beneficial to the communities that were hit the hardest back in the early 80s. And those are the areas that were ravaged by these drug traffickers.
Let me also just say something. I really think the corrosion in this discussion, and the reason it may be unhelpful, is that there are embedded falsehoods in this. Mm-hmm. The prisons, and I think there was a reference this morning, I saw a little bit of this on the streaming feed, there was an admission that low-level nonviolent drug offenders are not filling our prisons. That's been repeated by a lot of people. It's just ridiculous when you look at the data. So let's come to grips with the reality.
The data I've seen is that half of all the inmates in federal prisons are there on drug offenses.
What federal prison is a specific area of enforcement. 40% of the people that I think have been released in this last tranche are illegal foreign alien drug offenders. Okay, so they were interdicted moving drugs from places like Mexico and Colombia. Now, let me finish. The decline in violent crime and the concentration of offenses that are putting people in state prisons, the biggest single category, are violent repeat offenders. You've had violent crime go down. Tens of thousands of people have not been victimized since we had the increased enforcement. Now the issue is, well, we're not comfortable with the number of people in prison. We value our freedom. We think everybody should be able to use their opportunities. Every time someone goes into prison or gets convicted is a failure in most of our minds to some extent. So we want to fix that ahead of it. But the way to fix that is not simply to say, we're not going to enforce the law. We did that 25 years ago, and we had a lot of crime. So we know what doesn't work, and let's not have amnesia. What we need to do is to bring people, into a situation where they're not going to be criminals when they're at risk. We have not done a good job on that, and that's not the criminal justice system's fault. That's the problem of societal institutions, beginning with the family and schools and public health. Now, secondly, what we need to do is take the people who are in prison and allow reentry that works. Some of that may be involved with treatment, mental health treatment, care, reentry programs, and support. When I was in office, we put a lot of money into programs that would be things like treatment in the criminal justice system, diversion programs in drug courts, working on juvenile offenders, working on reentry programs for people coming out of institutions. That's not a Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal matter. That's something that everybody in good faith wants to have. The problem is, when people talk about it up here, when it comes time to appropriate money, they don't do it.
Okay, so
you don't have those programs when you need them.
You're not saying that it's mutually exclusive, longer, harsher sentences and rehabilitating people in prison and treatment programs.
Even if you don't like a 12-year sentence,
say,
after 12 years, that person's coming out. Okay. So if you want to not create a process of repeated victimization, what you're going to have to do is do a better job to give those people a way of integrating and not becoming victimizers. But those that can't be rehabilitated, you have to take them out of the community. You have to protect the Angela Dawsons and her 5 children from being killed. And you have to protect neighborhoods from being infested with predatory criminals and drug trafficking.
Let me give, as you may be sensing, y'all, I've got a little bit of work to do to persuade the audience here. So let me give you a chance.
Well, I've been in a lot of places, and I've been in a lot of places in this city, and this audience is not a cross-section. I'm sorry.
Let me give you each 60 seconds. Hold on. They've listened to the other views. Let's give them a chance to hear theirs.
I know, I'm Darth Vader for the program.
Yeah,
it's all right.
There's a sequel coming out. There's a chance for rehabilitation. What, if you had 60 seconds to make the case to people who believe that the system of mass incarceration as it exists is a blight on minority communities, is exacting a huge cost on already vulnerable communities, who think that mass incarceration is a pox on American values, what's the best case you can make for why harsher sentences, being tougher on crime, is the solution, is the way forward? Steve, you want to tackle that one?
Well, sure, I'd be glad to. First of all, let's make sure we all remember back in the 80s the statutes I'm talking about, the very sentencing structure that's under attack now is one that was put in with wide bipartisan support. And by wide bipartisan support, I mean to include that it was being pushed by the Black Caucus. So this isn't a racial issue. The reason the Black Caucus was pushing that legislation was because those communities were being victimized disproportionately. As we release these people, we see the same thing, and John said this, we're repeating history. The same thing's happening as we release these violent criminals, these high-level drug traffickers. It's those very communities that are being victimized, and we're making a mistake. We're playing with fire here.
One thing that's interesting, though, where we are not seeing a repeat of history is we're seeing the Obama administration pushing hard for lesser sentencing. We're seeing the Koch brothers saying the same thing. We're seeing Newt Gingrich has come out and supported this. Rand Paul has come out and said, I'll read you the latest quote from Charles Koch. Massive sentences are ruining lives. They are monstrous. They are obscene. I mean, President Obama said it's not often you get the Koch brothers and the NAACP wind up on one side of an issue. But when it comes to lesser sentences for these drug crimes, there's a rare alliance there. Is this a ship that's sailed?
Well, look, again, I said I started work in the Reagan administration. One of the things that Ronald Reagan is famous for saying is that facts are stubborn things. A lot of times people forget their history. They forget the people who are going to really pay the price when they talk about this. I'm always struck at how many people who talk about this are not going to live in communities where the people you want released are going to go back to. I think you got to protect people like the young father in Baltimore who was assassinated the other day, trying to protect his children. That's a voice that's not heard. I'm not sure it was heard today here, maybe. But that's a voice that I've spent a lot of time with.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time with kids in treatment, and I spent a lot of times with people in prison, frankly. And the fact is, we aren't going to get there by saying a certain number of people, whether or not they're justly convicted, whether or not they committed a crime, shouldn't go to prison. That's just going to bring more victimizers, and it's not about punishing people. It's about protecting people and allowing people to go on in their lives without being themselves a source of victimizing others or being victims themselves. When you say the criminal justice system has failed, there are thousands of people alive today, many of them, in fact, maybe arguably most of them, young black males, that would have been dead under the old regimes. So the fact of the matter is, in a certain way, you're criticizing the success from the hindsight of and the luxury of not facing some of these problems. Now, I do think you have to reincorporate people from prison, but we're not going to do that by eliminating accountability. You don't get better performance by eliminating accountability. You get better performance in our society by encouraging responsible behavior.
And I appreciate that, and y'all raised lots of things. We could take this discussion for another hour because you prompt a lot of things that I would love to be able to follow up on. But we have time for one more question, and I would like to raise the stakes. Look at this. Setting aside economic considerations, recidivism, legal considerations, what about just the plain old American value of redemption, that people deserve a second chance? You can make a mistake, you can pay for it, you should be able to come out after having served a sentence that is proportionate to your crime. Why not for these drug offenders?
I don't think any of us are opposed to that. I've never met anybody that I work with in the government that's against that. I've never met anybody in the nonprofit area that's against that. Of course we want people to be redeemed. I mean, that's kind of in our DNA as Americans. We believe in second, third, and fourth chances. We want to see people use their skills and be successful. I don't think the fact that somebody says, look, there's a legitimate and just reason why people go to prison for certain kinds of offenses. We can argue about how long, but I don't think that corrections or consequences mean you don't believe in redemption. In fact, I think the strongest argument is that when you hold people accountable, they see the need to change their behavior. And we talk a lot about prison not being effective and recidivism, but a significant portion, depending on how you look at it, of people who go to prison do redeem themselves and go on to productive lives. So I do think that we want to increase that number. And again, I didn't start out at this. I started out at this in the education and the treatment side. But I do think the criminal justice system is now being maligned for things. It's being criticized for things that it's really not doing. And on the other hand, we're trying to change it in ways that are going to make people's lives worse. The only reason I have continued to talk about this, because I don't need to, is I know too much about the people who will be victims when we make bad policy, when we don't provide effective education, when we allow drug trafficking to go on in young people's lives, when we don't protect innocent citizens who are going to be victims. And I do think that we are on the lip of making a serious mistake that is completely unnecessary because we have the knowledge to not do it.
Steve, very quick last word.
Well, the only thing that I would point out is that we've talked about the incarceration rate going up and the impact on violent crime. What we haven't talked about is that the early releases and sentencing reform that are already in place, and the fact that we're right now we have a 20% or higher homicide increase in 35 major cities across the country. We're already going back up. Prison rate, we've dropped the prison population in the federal system. We'll have by the end of this fiscal year by 11%. We've cut back on prosecutions in the federal system in the last 5 years by about 25%. And these are having an impact in our community. And we're in the midst of the worst heroin and opioid epidemic in our history. The right response to this is not to reduce the penalties, not to release wholesale thousands of experienced high-level drug traffickers. It's just the wrong approach.
And of course, many questions about what's the cause and effect and all of that. Do you two want to pre-butt who's following us on stage next? No? All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you for having us.